Everyone. My name is Lucy. I'm an attorney at the Legal Aid Society. I represent primarily NYCHA public housing residents and then residents who were former public housing residents who are now PACT converted residents. My real specialty for the past 10 or so, 12 years has been focusing on NYCHA and NYCHA's public housing. Prior to that, I was in the Bronx, in housing court, defending against evictions and representing tenants in individual eviction proceedings. It's lovely to be here tonight, and we, love anything that Palante does, and we support all of the work that they do in your community.
Okay. So I'm gonna put up your slides.
Okay. So just for the benefit of anyone that's here, I put together just a very short, like 4 slides, just to kind of guide the conversation that, well, mostly me just talking at you until we all get to see each other and or do a Q&A. I'm going to try not to go too in depth on things because it's obviously all of this warrants a much greater conversation, but I just wanted to start with kind of the basics between public housing, RAD, what is PACT, and then what is the trust, and just some things to consider in that. Jakari, whenever you want, you can move to the first slide. Okay, so the way I'm looking at this is, why are we here today? Why are we even having this conversation? Why is it that we've got a webinar today that is entitled, What is RAD, What is PACT, What is Trust? And the reason for that is that in the last number of years, NYCHA, together with lots of public housing authorities who manage public housing, have been looking at different ways to preserve public housing and keep public housing. And so that is really why we're seeing all of these different things pop up, these words like trust and PACT and RAD. And really what they're being called is preservation strategies. And I put it in quotes because Section 9 is very different than RAD PACT. Those are 2 different options for preserving. But what we're talking about is how NYCHA can continue to get funding to the buildings that it owns and manages to ensure that people are able to live in safe and habitable apartments. We've been reading a lot, you'll see it in the news all the time, about all of these different things, RAD, PACT, trust, public housing, funding, all of this kind of stuff. So that's really kind of the where I'm coming from. Just by way of background, I'm imagining that the people who are attending tonight have a great knowledge about public housing and an interest in public housing, but I just wanted to do some basics, which is when we talk about NYCHA, New York City Housing Authority, and public housing, all public housing in New York City is owned and managed by NYCHA. So there are other cities around the country or jurisdictions around the country where they might have a public housing authority. They might have many that own and manage public housing, but in New York City, all public housing is NYCHA public housing. So when we talk NYCHA, I always think public housing, and then I have to differentiate between Section 8. So anyway, NYCHA owns and manages, used to be about 178,000 units of public housing. As a result of some of the PACT conversions, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that number is down to more like 150, 55 or something. But it's a huge amount of units. The official kind of number of people that live in public housing is 400,000. We know that it's much closer to around 600,000. So it is a huge source of housing for hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers. One of the things that we all hear about, read about, and talk about is NYCHA's capital needs backlog. They estimate that there are $78 billion of unmet capital needs, which is real stuff in buildings like elevators, roofs, boilers, the real kind of like the structures around the buildings, not the like kind of everyday little repairs. But they're now estimating that's at around $78 billion for its whole portfolio. They also have been running what's called an operating deficit, which is on a day-to-day basis. They're struggling to keep up with just making ends meet on a daily basis. Funding for public housing is federal under Section 9 of the US Housing Act, but public housing in New York City also receives some funds from New York State and New York City. And that will come in later when we talk about some of the different strategies that they're looking at to try and meet these needs that they have. What I'm going to talk about in the next 3 slides is kind of the topic, the subject of this webinar, which is Section 9, RAD Pact and Trust. Okay, so Section 9, I think it's fair to say that until we started talking about RAD Pact, we didn't really speak about public housing as being Section 9. It was always just public housing. But now to differentiate it from these other programs, people kind of talk about it now as Section 9. So I think it's just important to understand that public housing in Section 9 is used interchangeably. Public housing is funded through the federal government, and the federal government annually appropriates through Congress. They appropriate funds at the federal level during the budget process to then give to HUD, which is the federal agency that manages the money, to allocate to public housing. That money is under the public housing funds is allocated between 2 different funds. One is called the operating funds, which manages which funds kind of the day-to-day running of different units. And then you have what's called capital funds. In the past 30 years or so, the funding that's been allocated to public housing by the federal government has really decreased substantially. And what we're seeing across the whole country, and which impacts NYCHA a lot because of the number of units that we have. We are the biggest public housing authority in the nation running public housing, is like a lack of funding, adequate funding. And so what's happening is the capital funds that are coming from the federal government are not meeting the needs for fixing the buildings, and the operating funds are not enough to help run the buildings on a day-to-day basis. When we talk about public housing, and this goes back to what I said beforehand, and this is what's important when we start talking about RAD Pact and the Trust, is that under public housing, NYCHA owns and manages all of its public housing portfolio, which means that not only does it manage the funds that are coming in, but it also manages the properties. So the property manager that is on the ground in different developments is NYCHA employees, and they are unionized, and they are part of NYCHA's employees, which I think is around 12,000. And that is a big distinction between what we're going to talk about in a few minutes under the RAD Pact and Trust. And this is a lot of information, and I know it's a lot, but I can always talk more if anyone wants me to. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that they have been looking, NYCHA, at different ways to try and address the great need to make repairs at these developments, and to also address the operating fund deficit that they have. There's one program, the PACT program, and I'm going to explain to you the difference between RAD and PACT, but it involves a conversion to Section 8. And when we talk about the trust, I want you to also understand that it also involves a conversion to Section 8. So 2 of these strategies to try and get more money to fund repairs are both involving conversions to Section 8, but in different ways. So in 2011, the federal government passed a piece of legislation called the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, otherwise known as RAD. And what RAD says is that if you, as a public housing authority, apply to us for approval, you can convert from being Section 9 public housing to Section 8, which is a different source of funding and subsidy. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why that's important. So in New York City, NYCHA decided to call its RAD program PACT. PACT stands for, a terrible acronym, Permanent Affordability Commitment Together. So, but it's called PACT. And I personally, in my job, I refer to RAD in New York City and NYCHA's program as PACT, because it's not all just RAD. So just think of it as being PACT. So there's this RAD statute, and basically what it says is, if you're a public housing authority, you can lease your properties with our approval to a new public-private entity. And by virtue of you doing that leasing, a long-term lease, you are able to now access funding under Section 8. And so that conversion from Section 9 funding to Section 8 does something. And what it does is, under the PACT program, is it brings in more subsidy than the public housing operating and capital fund subsidies do. And so that is a very attractive thing for a public housing authority to get, because it means that there's going to be more money to do things. And then the other thing that happens when you do a RAD conversion or a PACT conversion is that you've now leased it to this public-private company. And then what happens is, you can now, that new entity, we call it an entity, but the new company can then go out and borrow and get investors to either put in equity, put in funds, or they can borrow against this promise of Section 8 funding to be able to get money to make repairs. And the thing is, under Section 9, public housing, by law, you are not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to take a mortgage. You're not allowed to borrow against the properties. But once they've transferred to Section 8, they can do that. And so what the federal government saw was, this was a way to try and get more money to public housing authorities that Congress was not willing to fund, because no one at that point really wants to fully fund public housing. So this was a way to try and get more money. But it does involve privatization, essentially. So one of the things is, not only does it involve transferring to a public-private entity, a new company, but it also does involve, private investment, and to my next point, private property management. So once you convert under PACT conversion, the property management is no longer, the ones that are on the ground at your development, is no longer NYCHA employees. They're not unionized NYCHA employees. They are now private property management. NYCHA itself does stay involved, because what they do is they manage and administer the Section 8 subsidy that is now going to be the source of your subsidy for your apartment. And so what will happen is, you're no longer under NYCHA's public housing program. You now are sitting under NYCHA's Section 8 leased housing department program, where they are literally administering the Section 8 subsidy that goes to your apartment. And again, you get private management, but you get, NYCHA still remains, first of all, they remain the owner of the land and the property, because they just do a leasing to this other private entity, but they also administer the Section 8 voucher. Chikari, do you want to go to the next slide? So you've got public housing, Section 9, that we all know and love, and then you've got trying to find ways to try and get more money outside of the public housing program, which involves going to Section 8 and public-private privatization under the PACT, RAD PACT program. And then in 2022, New York State passed a law that created another way to access Section 8 funding for NYCHA. And what it did is, it created the New York City Public Housing Preservation Trust, which we all refer to as the Preservation Trust. And so what it did is, it said, we're going to create this authority that's called the Preservation Trust. And the trust is going to have board members made up of some people that are appointed by the mayor, some people that are appointed by NYCHA, some people that are appointed by the state, and they're going to sit on this board, and they're going to have this separate authority. And instead of NYCHA seeking to lease to a private entity under the RAD PACT program, they can seek to lease to this trust, the preservation trust. And I write here, can under certain circumstances transfer. And the reason I say that is that if NYCHA does seek to transfer a property, again, by lease to the trust, it needs to get approval from the board of NYCHA. It needs to get approval from the trust, but it also requires a vote. A vote from the residents at a site, at a particular development, in favor of that transfer to the trust. Recently, there have been 2 votes held by NYCHA at Nostrand Houses and at Bronx River Addition. And they held the vote to see whether or not residents wanted to transfer to Section 8 under the trust, transfer to Section 8 under RAD Pact, or remain in Section 9. And there's a website with the trust that you can go and look at, and you can see the voting requirements and the procedures. But it is a vote. There has to be 20% of the heads of household who participate in that vote in order for it to be considered valid. And then from there, they tally the votes and see what the results are and see, you know, which one was voted for in a high percentage. But there's a 100-day engagement period and then a 30-day voting period, and you can vote in person, online, or by mail. But one of the key kind of aspects of that trust conversion is the vote. The other thing about the trust is in the legislation that's written into the law, the New York State law, is that the property management will remain NYCHA. So it doesn't become a private property management team. It remains unionized public NYCHA management. So it basically will look the same in the sense that you have the teams that, or maybe new teams, but you'll have NYCHA employees who are on a day-to-day basis managing the property, which is different than under a PACT conversion, where a whole new team comes in from a whole new property management team. But the same with the conversion to Section 8 under PACT. NYCHA still continues to administer the Section 8 subsidy that is now the source of the subsidy for your apartments. And so NYCHA's leased housing department will manage the Section 8, and NYCHA management will manage the property management. So it really remains under NYCHA's umbrella. While not under public housing, it will now be under Section 8, but it still remains NYCHA for all intents and purposes, but under now the trust. Jakari, go to the next slide. I just wanted to talk, and this is, I know this is so much information, but I do want to just talk about a couple of things. So resident protections is obviously one of our highest, like the highest priority for us as tenant attorneys. There are some things that are noticeable under all 3 of these, the Section 9 and Section 8 under PACT and Section 8 under the trust, which is permanent affordability, right? That's one of the key protections that anyone living in public housing is going to be looking for, meaning 30% of your adjusted income, and knowing that that is the way it's going to be forever. And that's guaranteed under the 3 programs. The RAD statute itself specifically says that. The trust legislation specifically says that. The other thing is each one of those programs requires renewal leases. So it's similar in that regard to kind of rent stabilization, which is you sign a lease, and then unless it is terminated for good cause, you are automatically eligible for a renewal lease every 12 months. The key part about the RAD legislation that made it different from other attempted kind of efforts by HUD and the feds to think about ways to deal with these issues is that RAD specifically in the statute says there shall be no rescreening of residents at the time of that conversion from public housing to Section 8. There'll be no rescreening for income and no rescreening for criminal background. And that's really, really key because There have been some other programs that didn't do that, and people unfortunately ended up, losing their homes and being displaced. So the no rescreening is key, and that happens under, obviously, if you stay Section 9, you wouldn't be rescreened, but it happens under both PACT and the trust. Do all transactions look the same? So no. What we see across the board is so the key point, right, to converting to the Section 8 under either PACT or the trust is to try and get the repairs that are needed to both the buildings and to your apartments. And some transactions have occurred and residents have been able to stay in place during those repairs because the needs of the building were not so great that they couldn't stay there. However, there have been some conversions where people have been temporarily relocated, some only within the development itself, and some to other developments and some to other apartments. It really just depends on how deep the needs are for the buildings, but that is definitely something that needs to be considered in the different programs and the different funds that can be raised by this conversion. Some residents have relocated only for 6 weeks. Some have been relocated for months and up to years. So the other thing is, how big is the transaction? Some of the PACT conversions have been single developments. Some have been bundles. So some have been 11 or 12 different developments across quite a wide geographic area. And then some have been 5 or 6 different developments within a smaller geographic area. The trust, the 2 sites that have so far gone through the trust vote have been single developments and are much more like smaller and more contained. So one should be thinking about the transaction and what it looks like. And then the other thing is the scope of work, and that kind of goes back to the in-place repairs and how deep the work is that's needed. So under the RAD statute, which is also included under the PACT umbrella, the new development team needs to be able to show that they have the financial capacity to address the 20-year needs of the development. And within 2 years of the conversion to Section 8, they need to be able to address the most pressing needs in developments, which usually ends up being bathrooms, kitchens, floors, and elevators. Under the trust, that is not actually written into the legislation, and we're trying to talk to NYCHA about committing to that, but that is not part of the legislation, which is different than the RAD PACT statute. Also thinking about public oversight, obviously, under public housing, there is a lot of ability to have public oversight. There are requirements that they publish annual plans, and a whole host of other things under the federal law. And in addition to that, the city council has oversight capacity for public housing, which it doesn't necessarily have over Section 8. You may have read recently about what if the new private property managers are not good under a PACT transaction. One was just removed from the Hope Gardens PACT conversion. And that is something that you need to think about if you're faced with or thinking about a PACT conversion. Repairs and transparency behind repairs. As a public housing resident, in order to get repairs, you have to call the CCC, the NYCHA Customer Contact Center, or go to your property manager or use the NYCHA app. And there's not really much public transparency over that in terms of work orders and how quickly they're being addressed. There is a metrics page on NYCHA's website, and they have become better at doing some work on transparency, but it is very different than, for example, if you live in private housing or you're a PACT converted resident, where when you have a repair need, you can call the property management or you can call HPD, either directly or through 311, and then an inspector will come, and if needed and if they can put a violation code, and then that goes on the website, and anyone can just go onto the HPD website and see what the state of the building is and if there are open repairs. And then evictions obviously has been a very important topic that people are talking about, which is are once these are converted to Section 8 under PACT, or maybe even under the trust, our eviction rate's going to be increased because of this conversion to Section 8. Will private property developers be more incentivized to bring eviction proceedings? Does it end up in an eviction, or is it just more filings in housing court? And that's just something that that needs to be discussed further and kind of looked into. But it's definitely something that that people should be considering if they are faced with a choice between remaining Section 9 or going to Section 8, either under PACT or the trust. I'm looking at the time, Jakari, and I know that's a lot of information, but those are just kind of, that's a very, very high level overview of the 3 different Section 9, and then the other two are both Section 8, but then under PACT and under the trust. What I want to do now is show a short video, very short, which we created together with Community Service Society, which we created it to be able to explain to people who were facing a vote for the trust or Section 9 or PACT, and we wanted to be able to explain the difference between Section 9 and then Section 8 PACT and Section 8 trust. So yeah, if you can play it, Jakari, that would be
after this video, everyone, we're gonna start the Q&A. So if you have a question, please place it in the Q&A box. Thank you.
Section 9 is a housing program that has historically provided a lot of protections, rights, and stability for tenants. NYCHA Public Housing is funded by Section 9. That gives NYCHA money to maintain the building and pay for repairs, fixing boilers, elevators, roofs, and plumbing. For a long time, the federal government has been cutting funding for Section 9, making it hard for NYCHA to cover repairs and day-to-day maintenance. Those cuts in funding have created a backlog of repairs that cost about $78 billion. And that means NYCHA residents have been living in unsafe and unsanitary conditions. To get the funding to make those repairs, NYCHA has been using a different federal program called Section 8. Section 8 gives NYCHA money to cover maintenance, but not for repairs. To cover the cost of repairs, NYCHA can create a partnership that can get other sources of funding for repairs. Currently, there are 2 types of partnerships that NYCHA has created: PACT and the Public Housing Preservation Trust. Through PACT, the partnership is with NYCHA and a private development team. The private development team collects rent and hires their own property manager to make repairs and manage the building. Through the trust, the partnership is with a government organization. The trust collects rent and makes repairs, and the property is still managed by NYCHA. This is a big change, which is why NYCHA is asking residents to choose to vote for the trust, PACT, or to remain in Section 9. Residents will have 30 days to vote in person, online, or via mail. For residents to make their vote count, 20% of heads of households in a development need to vote. Get the word out to other residents in your building to make sure the future of your development reflects your wants and needs. This is your home. Vote to have a say in what happens to it. Find out here if your development will vote. To learn more about Section 9, PACT, and the Trust, read this booklet, or get in touch with Community Service Society and the Legal Aid Society.
Lucy, do you know where that booklet is located? Because maybe we could share it with the attendees, that booklet. Wait, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now, Jakari? Yeah, we have lots of physical copies of it, and we have it in English, Spanish, Russian, and Chinese. But I believe it's also on the website, like CSS's website.
After this webinar, can you send it to me so I can follow up for everybody?
Yeah, absolutely. And then I also wanted to give you our number for our legal aid helpline in case people have questions about stuff, which is 212, and you can send it out later.
Yeah,
298-3450. But that I just want people to understand that video was made to be able to explain to people who are facing a vote about the different options. But it doesn't mean that, like, I think it's a helpful video because it shows the different sources of funding and the different umbrellas under Section 8. But it doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to go and get a vote, because currently under PACT, there is no requirement that they have a vote. I think they might be moving in that way of having some type of resident survey or resident vote about whether people go into PACT, but it's only in the trust legislation that it's a requirement.
Okay, thank you. So we're gonna start with the first question, which is, would conversion affect my Section 8, and if so, how would I obtain new housing?
I would it affect my Section 8? So I guess I'd like to understand, does that mean that someone is currently residing in public housing with a Section 8 voucher? And if they are, it won't impact their Section 8. They'll still, so one of the key points about all three of those is that you always have a right to remain in your apartment at any conversion, or obviously if you stay Section 9. But under RAD, one of the other protections is that you have a right to remain, which differs from some of the other programs which didn't necessarily guarantee that right. But yes, if you have a Section 8 voucher currently and you're living in public housing, you can still remain there.
Okay, thank you. It says, I've noticed more tenants being evicted since the introduction of RAD and PACT. Unlawful reasons. Why is that, and am I safe?
It's actually there's now metrics on NYCHA's website that go through the eviction data that they're receiving now from the PACT development teams that they've only just started receiving since 2021. It's quite difficult, I think, at this time to know whether eviction could increase, because the first PACT conversion was in 2017, and then there were a few more in 2018 and 19, and then obviously with the pandemic we had a moratorium for very many for 2 years, right, until 2021, and so it's difficult to see whether there is an increase, but I think it's fair to say that once a PACT conversion happens, there are probably an increase, and I was looking at the metrics earlier in the week. There's an increase in certain types of proceedings in housing court, which are known as holdover proceedings. And that's because there are apartments that haven't actually entered into a lease under the PACT program, because either the person is not there anymore or not entitled to a lease and things like that. And then they're taking action on those kind of cases. I don't know if that leads to then an eviction, but I know that probably filings are up. I was looking at the metrics, but you can see it on NYCHA's website. But I don't think at this point that actual evictions are up. But I do think as well that you're going to see an increase in non-payment proceedings as well. Jakari, you're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, the next question is, will my rent go up once the conversion is complete?
That's a really great question, and I should have addressed that earlier. No. All three of those programs set your rent at 30% of your adjusted gross income, with deductions and anything that goes into that. There is an instance in which you might see your rent go up, which is if you are on what's known as a flat rent, which is where your income is higher and you're now paying probably around 20% of your income towards rent. And under federal law that I think was passed in 2018 or 19, HUD said that you now have to all increase so that you're all paying 30%. So it might be that you do increase a little bit, but the law also says that NYCHA can only increase your rent over a period of 5 years by a certain percentage. And so, yes, in some instances, you may see an increase, but it will never be more than up to 30% of your income.
Mm-hmm. The next question says, so there will be a private landlord that will take over the building, or will it still be partially owned by the city?
So under the PACT program, NYCHA still retains ownership of the land and the buildings. They enter into a 99-year lease with the PACT team and the PACT partners. But for all intents and purposes, the PACT, new PACT entity is going to be running it for that length of time. So yes, it's still owned by NYCHA, but under PACT, it goes to private management, and under the trust, if the development gets offered a voting voting procedure for the trust and then votes for the trust, it will be transferred by lease to the trust, but the property management will still remain NYCHA. It will not be privatized.
Says, does succession rights still apply for NYCHA RAD program?
These are all such good questions. Yes, there are succession rights, and they are, it's tricky. So you still have the same rights, which is that if you are on the household composition and you've been there for, you can show that you've been there continuously and for a period of at least 1 year before the tenant of record moves out of the apartment, then you can be eligible to succeed to the apartment. There is also a new PACT pilot program, which is expanding that eligibility for households that otherwise might not be on the lease at the time of conversion, who can then apply to be added as the head of household, and that's known as the PACT pilot project. And you can find that information on their website about that. But yes, you still have succession rights.
Okay, great, good. So the next question is, my apartment needs extensive work. Basically the whole apartment needs to be redone. I was told I was not being moved out or temporarily relocated. How is this legal? I don't feel safe with fumes and debris.
So if you want, call our line that I think Jakari put into the chat. But you yeah, just reach out to us. I mean, obviously you're entitled to repairs. I think in some instances, obviously unless they're very extensive, they will not temporarily relocate someone. But if you have a need that is considered a reasonable accommodation to accommodate one of your protected needs, such as a disability or a health reason, then they may temporarily relocate you during the time within which they're making the repairs. But otherwise, they usually would try and make the repairs with you in place. But obviously, under the law, you are entitled to have those repairs made. And so you could take them to housing court under what's known as an HP action, where you sue NYCHA. But you also might be able to, I mean, yeah, we all know what the work order situation looks like at NYCHA. But feel free to reach out to us if you want more information on that.
Thank you. The next question is in Spanish. So I'm gonna have our interpreter Daniel come on to interpret it for us. Daniel.
Is Daniel on mute or?
Oh, you have to make sure you're on the English channel at the globe. You see that globe at the bottom of your screen? Do you see it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's a great question. Yes, under these programs, both public housing and Section 8, rent is always based on your income, and rent is calculated based on 30% of your income, adjusted income, but it's always going to be based on your income. Yes.
Okay. The next question says, housing opportunities through Modernization Act is different, especially when it comes to calculating rents in Section 8 and Section 9. Under the conversions, is there any confusion, especially for the trust?
This is a great question as well. So HOTMA, which is the housing modernization that was referenced in the question, I think I'd have to check this, and pardon my ignorance on this, but I believe it applies just to public housing. It basically, for the first time ever, says that under public housing, if you reach a certain income level for a couple of years, 24 months, or asset levels, that you can be terminated from the public housing program and offered, you won't be evicted, but you'll be offered what's known as a non-public housing lease. And so your rent will be set at fair market rent. And there's definitely been a lot of people, not a huge number of people, but people have been receiving throughout NYCHA public housing notices that are now saying you've had that 24 months of being over income, and now under HOTMA, we're offering you a non-public housing lease. Under Section 8, there are times within which you might become ineligible for the subsidy based on your income, which is that if your income becomes so high that it's above the contract rent for the apartment, then you might go into, after a year, you might go into what's known as zero subsidy status, at which point you're going to be paying for the full rent on the apartment. It won't be limited to your income.
Okay, thank you, Lucy. The next question says, are you familiar with BHA? And you can follow along, Lucy.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Am I familiar with?
All the way towards the bottom.
Are you familiar with Boston Housing? Yeah. If so, do you feel the NYCHA residents and all stakeholders would be better served?
Let me read it. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Are you familiar with BHA receivership? If so, do you feel that NYCHA residents are stakeholders who, If so, do you feel that NYCHA residents and all stakeholders would be better served going through receivership? Also, what is the estimated cost for convert an apartment versus Section 8 demo? Please advise. Has the monitor met with legal aid or resident?
So I mean, I'm familiar with receiverships in the sense that obviously in 2018, NYCHA was faced with the threat of receivership that led to that settlement with the Southern District. And I think everyone at that point breathed a big sigh of relief, because there are many reports out there that show that receivership can be, really bad for public housing authorities. And our biggest fear in New York City was that a receivership would lead to kind of selling off public housing and just wholesale displacement of residents and demolition of those buildings. And so we were, relieved to see the monitorship rather than receivership. In terms of the cost, I didn't really understand the question, but in terms of meeting the new monitor, we have not yet met with the new monitor, and I'm actually adding that to my to-do list because I know that we wanted to do that, but it's just been recent and a little bit crazy. But yes, we will definitely meet with the new monitor to find out what their priorities are and to inform them about some of the things that we think they should be focusing on.
Okay, thank you. The next question says, where would a NYCHA tenant obtain their original lease for NYCHA brownstones located on the Upper West Side, especially leases dating back to the 1970s or earlier?
Another great question. Okay, so you can do a FOIL request, which is a Freedom of Information request, to get your tenancy file. So you can email NYCHA at its foil@nycha.nyc.gov and submit a request to get access to that file, or you can go to your property management and also ask them to help you get access to it. They usually
the email again.
Oh, FOIL, FOIL at nycha.nyc.gov. They used to keep those tenancy files on site, but then a number of years ago they digitized them and sent them off of site. So now you actually kind of have to do a FOIL request to get them. You should, if it usually takes quite a long time, but they'll send you a notice saying when it's available, and then you'll go to review the file. One of the things actually is that are they talking about WSUR brownstones or SUR? But one of the things that we're asking them to do is whenever there's a conversion under Section 8 to either PACT or the trust, that all tenant files get photocopied and copied and put either onto a disk or some other form that's accessible to each individual that needs it, so that they have access to that file. Because once you convert to Section 8, it does become kind of harder for you to get access to that file, because while your public housing you kind of just have an automatic right to it. And then once you're Section 8, it just becomes a little bit trickier. So that's something we're working on as well. But if you do need it, you should do a FOIL request for it.
Thank you. I think that's the last question that we have for tonight. So I think we're going to come to a close. So I want to thank Lucy for joining us and being here tonight, and providing us with all the information on the NYCHA RAD and NYCHA PACT programs. If you want more insight, or if you were confused about something, Lucy, do you have like a general number that they could call?
Yeah, we have that number that I gave you, right? The 212-298-3450. And we also have an email address, which is public housing unit. Here, I'll give it to you. Public housing unit at legal-aid.org. No, I know that it was a lot of information and quite hurried, but and it's a lot. It's this is something I work on every day, and still every day I learn of new things that I didn't understand before. So it is a lot, and no question is too simple, and any question is a good question as far as I'm concerned.
How tonight went.
I hope that everyone's satisfied.
I think so. I think
Anyway, I'm happy to come back anytime.
yes. Thank you. Okay. Good night, everyone.
Bye, Jakari.
Thank you.